We all have an ego, but some of us have an ego that is beyond out of control. When our personal perception of ourselves is so out of control, our ego takes hold and it could develop into a disorder. One person who this can be said about is Tony Stark, aka the Iron Man.
Tony Stark makes you feel he's a cool effect with a heart of steel.
As Iron Man, all jets ablaze, he's like that sight with color rays. Amazing armor,
Iron Man.
a blazing power.
Let's look at one of the most notoriously arrogant individuals in the MCU and see if S.H.I.E.L.D.'s own assessment of his textbook narcissism is full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. Before we delve into NPD, let's make sure we all know who Tony Stark is, just the way he would like it.
I am Iron Man.
Oh, and if Tony Stark can't keep his own secret identity a secret, you bet we're gonna have some spoilers. Okay, you know what? I wasn't even gonna mention this right out of the bat. Didn't even make it like 4 sentences. I'm already going off script. So, I've just recently seen Endgame. Let me make that very clear. I wrote this script prior to Endgame, but I want to take this extra time to say there could be Endgame spoilers because, like I said, I can't stick to script. So, one more time, I don't want to be the guy to ruin it for you. There could maybe possibly be Endgame spoilers. We'll see as we go along. With that said, as with every comic book character, Iron Man, aka Tony Stark, has had many variations. He's been in cartoons, comic books, and he's been in a popular movie or two. For the purpose of this episode, we're going to keep what is consistent through the majority of the variations, though almost entirely focus on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as that is the most well-known version of Tony Stark. Stark is a childhood prodigy and the son of the CEO of Stark Industries. After his parents died in a car accident, Tony inherited Stark Industries, where he used his vast resources for the development of many inventions, but namely he was known for his weapon designs. Later in life, when showcasing his Jericho missiles in Afghanistan, he was attacked and kidnapped by terrorists. These terrorists demanded Tony to build the Jericho missiles for them, and Tony agreed. Also, during the kidnapping, Tony had shrapnel embedded in his chest that would kill him if it wasn't for the arc reactor he created and put into his chest to keep the shrapnel from reaching his heart while in captivity. That was a big sentence. I made a big boy sentence right there. Okay, moving on. And by agreed, I mean he built himself a walking metal death machine he used to escape. What is that metal he used, he asked? Steel. He used steel. That wasn't actually part of the script. I'm just a smartass. He took the idea of the iron suit and made it state-of-the-art using Stark Industries technology, becoming the hero known as Iron Man.
What?
Tony Stark is definitely arrogant and narcissistic. There's no doubt about that. However, that doesn't necessarily mean he could be classified with narcissistic personality disorder. It does take a lot more than that. The DSM-5 usually outlines criteria for someone who is narcissistic to roll over into a full-blown disorder. So, as we discuss the subject, remember there is a big difference between someone having narcissistic tendencies and having narcissistic personality disorder. It's important. I haven't stumbled yet on NPD. Feeling good about this. Next word is NPD. Narcissistic personality. Damn, I knew it. I saw it coming. I shouldn't have gloated. Narcissistic personality disorder is a personality disorder where an individual has an overinflated sense of self. They tend to have an exaggerated sense of self-importance and generally assumes everyone else sees their importance. They see themselves as superior to others and above the majority of people. They tend to look at themselves as special, especially when you compare themselves to common peasants.
Big man in a suit of armor. Take that off, what are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
I know guys with none of that worth 10 of you. I've seen the footage. The only thing you really fight for is yourself.
They know more than other people, even experts. An example of this would be they would argue with the doctor about a medical condition with no justified reason to do so. The doctor is obviously a moron simply because the narcissist knows better, usually meaning they don't want the statement to be true and not much more than that. They have little time for other people's problems, but think the world has all the time in the world for their own. More often than not, this is a mask for low self-esteem, but that's not always the case. I would say Tony Stark is one of those where I don't think he has low self-esteem. They also tend to have very delicate egos and take failure, rejection, and their shortcomings very hard. This is where I want to talk about Endgame, but I'm not, but I can't stress again. I'm going to say this like 7 times through this episode, I swear to God. There's going to be an Endgame spoiler. I'm going to go off script. I've already gone off so much my editor's going to kill me anyway, so might as well just keep adding spoiler warnings. Narcissistic personality disorder affects about 1 in 16 people and is more common in men than women in overall traits. Though women do tend to score much higher, specifically in arrogance and envy of other categories, than men do. It is seen in more individuals between 16 and 34 in ages, as well as those who are single versus married or divorced. What does that tell us? Not much, actually, in the grand scheme of things. I just like statistics, so there you go. Narcissistic personality disorder is a disorder, and like all disorders, it does have criteria for official diagnosis outlined in the DSM-5. That is what we'll be using to look at NPD and how much it applies to Tony Stark. I usually say if it applies, but come on, we're talking about Tony Stark, it will to some degree. In Tony's case, as with anyone, the individual needs to meet at least 5 of the 9 different criteria outlined for the diagnosis to be considered a disorder. The first criteria is that the person has this overglorified sense of self. Now, if any of these criteria fit Tony, this is definitely the one. I mean, sure, he's Iron Man, that's definitely spectacular. But even as Iron Man, he tends to overinflate himself, which takes a special brand of self-grandiose. Saying something like, oh, I don't know, that you self-privatize world peace to the UN in a meeting, that may be a good example of that. Though Tony may not have been aware people like Thor existed or Captain America was alive, I honestly think Tony believed his statement, and even an organization like S.H.I.E.L.D., who he definitely knew existed, may not have been a big part in keeping peace in the world, which Tony does not acknowledge publicly. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't have, even if S.H.I.E.L.D. was a bigger priority than it was at the time. The next one being preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideas of love. Again, Tony is extremely intelligent, inventive, powerful, and Scrooge McDuck level rich. We gotta remember this because we're talking about fantasies, not reality, and being honest about our actual successes, no matter how big, doesn't fit this criteria. If it's true, it's true. More importantly, we're talking about a psychological idea of fantasy, which is a little different as well. A fantasy is a thought or a set of thoughts that visualize outcomes that have not yet happened. At least not yet. Tony may be a smartass by calling himself a genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist, but it's not necessarily inaccurate. He could be considered all those things. But with that said, Tony does like to make wild claims, and they aren't completely true or accurate a lot of the times. He definitely likes to preoccupy himself with fantasies of grandeur that are not realities, again, at least yet. I also wanted to give you guys a critical eye on fantasy versus reality and how they could be considered generally arrogant, but not always the case. Again, this is about reality versus fantasy, and sometimes realities are big and grandiose, especially when we're talking about people like Tony Stark. So remember, there is a difference. Next, the individuals need to see themselves as special or unique and can only be understood by others of high status. In other words, Tony is so spectacular as a person that only other spectacular people would get him. Tony is something special, no doubt, even if we don't talk about him as Iron Man. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's so unique us common peasants don't understand him.
When did you become an expert in thermonuclear astrophysics?
Last night. The packet. Sobek's notes. The extraction theory papers. Am I the only one who did the reading?
Does Loki need any...
I mean, you don't need to be a genius or a superhero to see a lot of Tony's dreams and fears throughout most of the movies. I think it's also safe to say that Tony assumes a lot and sees himself as superior and is constantly misunderstood by people, even among his peers. I mean, look how he treats most people in the Iron Man universe. Well, in the Iron Man universe? If you ask Tony, that's accurate. I mean, look how he treats most people in the Iron Man and Avengers movies. Anyone who Tony does not see as his equal, he talks down to, if not flat out dismisses. Also, let's be honest here, the reality is that in the Avengers, Tony is not that special or unique. Being a genius and having your own walking arsenal is impressive, but it's about as impressive as, saying, being a super soldier, or a Norse god, or a walking green death machine of Smashy Smash, who is also a genius as a side gig. So with that said, let's make the next one real quick because it's simply the need of admiration of others. We're talking about Tony Stark, so yes, just yes, it applies. Tony is not shy about asking others to acknowledge how awesome he is. So, yep, moving on. The next criteria is having an overinflated sense of entitlement. They pretty much feel that they not only deserve special treatment, they should automatically have their usually unrealistic demands met. In their mind, it is their right for preferred treatment in all situations and others to acknowledge this.
Fury didn't tell me he was calling you in.
Yeah, there's a lot of things Fury doesn't tell you.
When the Avengers Initiative started, Tony just expected to be recruited. When he wasn't, he was mad. Damn it. I'm just gonna go, he was mad. Consultant wasn't good enough for him. If he wasn't an Avenger, S.H.I.E.L.D., a multi-billion-dollar internationally funded organization, couldn't afford him. These were Tony's own words. If Tony wasn't recruited the way he wanted to be and the way he was expecting, he wouldn't be a part of it. MPH's criteria is also taking advantage of others to achieve their own ends. I don't think we're talking about Tony in a malicious sense here, but it's definitely part of Tony's personality. He definitely takes advantage of others, usually by turning a blind eye. Taking advantage of war-torn countries for profit is an example of this. However, why it is good or bad to sell weapons of catastrophic capabilities could be a pretty big moral debate. But the key point in this is that Tony, mostly unconcerned with this, sold weapons to who he sold them to. Of course, he worked with the good guys, and the bad guys got what they deserved. That is the only possible outcome in Tony's mind. Tony is way too smart for that oversimplified rationalization. Though that is the classic example of individuals with NPD, how they can rationalize their negative behaviors. Of course, life is not that simple, and Tony did have some time to think about these kind of things when he was kidnapped, so he did come around and acknowledge that maybe there's more nuances to things like this. But yeah, in the beginning, Tony definitely had this black and white mentality that fit his narrative to make himself feel better about himself, if that makes any sense. Hopefully it did. I really think prior to the kidnapping, Tony was more concerned about money and showing off his creativity than worrying about who was using his weapons. So we've definitely cleared 5 of the 9 criteria with Tony, but there's definitely more he fits into, like lacking in empathy. Think about how he treated Aldrich Killian, who later created AIM and the Extremist Serum in the beginning of Iron Man 3. Not only did he dismiss Killian when they first met, but he completely blew off a very excited man who wanted to share his ideas with Tony. Tony dismissively set up an impromptu meeting with Killian, and not only did he not show up or even think about Killian again, but he really kind of crushed someone's dreams and didn't think twice about it. Not just to strangers, but think how he dismisses Peppa Potts. Damn it, I knew it! Peppa Potts. I work with kids, so I see the word pepper and I think Peppa Pig. Not just to strangers, but think about how he dismisses Pepper Potts' feelings a lot of the time. Though it is usually very casual, throughout a lot of the movies you can see Tony make a lot of decisions without thinking about Pepper. Again, I don't think Tony is actively trying to be an asshole, at least most of the time. He just doesn't think about others. He does what he wants, and that's the end of it. By now, those who have seen our video on psychopathy might have noticed that there are some of these criteria that could fall under the criteria of psychopaths. And if you did, good on ya. Psychopaths do have a different mentality to their mindset, though. We already did one episode on psychopaths, so I don't want to discuss too much of it in this episode, but you can see that episode at a later date. Watch this one. The main thing I'm bringing up right now is that all narcissists are not psychopaths, but all psychopaths are narcissists. I wanted to note that real quick just because some of you may have been comparing the two and wanted to address that for the curious. Nothing more, nothing less, really. But back on track, because I've been on track. I love when I say shit like back on track just because it's like there's assuming there was a track I was following in the first place, which I wasn't. This is why we need a script, people, and this is why my editor gets mad at me when I don't stay on it. I just got the coldest stare. Okay, next on the criteria is that those with narcissistic personality disorder tend to be envious of others, or at least want others to envy them, or bare minimum, assume everyone is envious of them. Again, we're talking about Tony here. Not much of this is a stretch to see how he thinks most people want to be him. He has money, he has power, he has fame, he has an iron suit. Who wouldn't want to be him? Never mind his negative qualities, because a narcissist tends to downplay negative qualities while overinflating their positive. We all do that to a certain degree, but narcissists tend to take that and crank that to a whole new level. In many cases, they almost dismiss having a flaw in their life or character entirely, or play it up as a lovable quirk, like Tony does. On to the last criteria, and definitely not the least, is showing an arrogant behavior or a generally arrogant attitude. See almost everything we just talked about. That is definitely a defining aspect of Tony, so I really don't have to delve much more into that, just see the rest of the episode. I'm pointing somewhere. So I think I made a pretty good case on why Tony would have narcissistic personality disorder, yeah? Well, there's one slight problem with what I did. Most of what I was referencing was Tony's behaviors in earlier movies. In the beginning, I would say most definitely he probably would suffer from NPD, but as time goes on, I'm not so certain about that. Once he started becoming Iron Man and he joined the Avengers, I think a lot of what I mentioned started to be replaced to some degree or another. Tony started to empathize with others. One thing I can think about is a grieving mother in the Civil War movie, or feeling remorse for his treatment to Killian, who we mentioned earlier. Now, Tony uses his inventiveness not only for his Iron Man weaponry, but nowadays he uses it in less high-profile ways, like creating a cleaner power source for the world. It's not nearly as glamorous as he tends to be, but it's still important work. He's even taken on sort of a pupil in Peter Parker, Spider-Man for those who don't know. Tony's become less preoccupied with himself and is now turning to benefiting the world and others, making the criteria above not so clean-cut as it was in the past. Yes, Tony is still arrogant and self-absorbed. I would say this is even safe to say that he's still pretty narcissistic, but it's being tempered by goodwill, empathy, and a sense of wanting to do the right thing. There are plenty of studies that show those diagnosed with NPD are not forever, and if they want to change, they can. If they want to grow as a person, they can. The key of what I'm pointing out here is that they need to want to change, and I would say Tony wants to, and kind of has. He is not just a man with power anymore, he is now starting to begin to act like a true superhero. So there you have it. It is very likely Tony could have been classified with narcissistic personality disorder at the birth of the MCU, but the probability of that starts to decline as he continues on as Iron Man and joins the Avengers. That's the great thing about disorders. They can be treated, and I think we're seeing that in Tony's case. Time will tell how much, but you'd be surprised in the behavior or the mentalities that can be diminished with the individuals who want them to be. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you thought it was interesting, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notify bell to keep up on our upcoming episodes. See you next time. Okay, nope. I'm rewinding that for a second. Okay. Spoiler. So I wrote this script before seeing Endgame. I'm gonna have to say this really quick. Endgame, I hit the nail on the head. Pat myself on the back. Tony watched the Endgame and you could still see that arrogance and narcissism that I'm talking about, but in essence, he really did change. He's thinking about Pepper a lot more. He's definitely thinking about the world. And I'm trying not to spoil too much for you guys. I'm really not, and I'm going off script, so forgive me, but I just really want to point out to all you guys that the last thing I was kind of saying there is that if you want to change, don't think it's beyond your point. Tony Stark is a character and he's fictional, sure, but he's a great example of what reality is. Especially when we're talking about narcissistic personality disorder. He was a complete arrogant narcissist, but at the end of Endgame, and okay, here's the big spoiler, the end of him, you can't say that anymore. It's okay to be a little arrogant. We all are sometimes, maybe Tony a little too much, but I just wanted to say that real quick, just because we're making this episode and I just thought it was a really good end to a really good character. So now I will say, see you next time. Just kidding, I'm really alive. We made it.